Good afternoon, everybody. You guys are here for our last lecture of the day, and this is a real treat. So, I have the very distinct honor and privilege to introduce Christine Griffen today. As many of you know, her and her husband Jeff own Griffen clocks, and they acquired the R&M imports from the Thatchers and the Herschede Hall Clock Company inventory and assets in 2019, and they continue to provide horological parts for everybody. Many of you are familiar with their catalog. I just wanted to use that as one of the identifiers of what Christine has to bring to all of us. But the real reason why she's here to talk with us is, like many of us, we have a clock story, and when you find something really special and you want to learn a little bit more about it, and then you want to learn a little bit more about it, and then a little bit more. Well, she has a wonderful journey that she's going to share with us about the Herschede Clock Company. And we are also very fortunate because today is really her debut presentation. And I'd also like to share that the story you're going to hear today has culminated in the production and authorship of this wonderful book that is hot off the press, that I understand. It's very new. Which press?
Is it available in the mark?
I believe
We have a couple left.
We have a couple left in
I need one.
Okay,
There's a couple.
we got one left.
Fortunate, that's a very good question, because we are so prepared today that I'm going to pass around this. If for any of those who would like Christine to reach out to you at some point in the very near future, just put your name here and a phone or email, however you'd like to be contacted, and pass it around. If the page fills up, just continue on. So there you go, Fortunate, thank you. So I am going to introduce Christine. Come on up, Christine, and the floor is all yours. So enjoy her story, and I'm looking very much forward to it. Thank you, Kathy.
Well, welcome. We are going to spend some time here talking about and learning about the early years of Herschede. There's so much history that has happened in the Herschede clock and jewelry business that I thought what I would do is focus on 1877 to 1922. It's probably the least known time of the companies, and so I thought I'd share some of the research and learnings that I have from that period of time. There's clearly a lot more that happened from 1922, 1923 to 1984 when they closed. And then even as they transitioned, after the production of clocks to parts, and that's where Mary Thatcher sitting here, and R&M purchased in 1992 the Herschede Hall Clock Company. And so Mary's been, Randy has been
Could you speak closer to the microphone?
Mary and Randy Thatcher have been, and Eddie have been very instrumental to continuing the Herschede parts in the industry. And then we were fortunate enough in 2019, working with Mary and the team, and we purchased the R&M assets and the Herschede parts as well. And so that's where the Griffins came into place. We have gone through a lot of changes and a lot of learning and a lot of new experiences. So it's been fun. So let's get started. All right, so what I'm going to cover is I'm going to give just a little bit of information about the family. When I started doing the research, the very first thing I had to do was who were the key executive players? Who were the leaders? And who were the visionaries and the strategic thinkers to help the Herschede grow over time? So I spent quite a bit of time in the first chapter in the book. It talks about the families and the players, including Howard Klein that bought the company in 1989. So we're going to just touch on some highlights there about the family. Then we're going to go into the executive summaries, the executive profiles. So I profiled all the executives so that we can understand who they were. Then we'll go and spend a little bit of time on the early business years, and then the movement, development, and ramp. So we'll briefly touch on that. The trademark overview, I thought it would be good for people to see the transitions of the trademarks that happened. And then we're going to wrap up the story with the last location that Frank Herschede built and what he got to enjoy before his passing. So we'll get started there. So the first thing about the family, there's a number of key players that many of you have not been privy to because they're not often talked about, but they were very instrumental in forming the company. So Frank Herschede, which all of you know, this company started in Cincinnati in 1877, and Frank Herschede was the one that started it, and he and Sadie was his wife, were the key players for starting the jewelry company and then Herschede Hall Clock Company. Well, another very key player was John A. Herschede, and that was Frank Hershede's brother, and he was the youngest brother of the siblings. And he actually joined the company when he was 13 years old and worked right next to Frank. And Frank mentored him, and John actually lived with Frank and Sadie in his very early years. So he was a very key player. He did considerable traveling. He was the one that pushed all of the grandfather clocks and the marketing of those clocks and exploring the East Coast, West Coast, the South. He was gone all the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's what I call Generation 1, okay? That's where it all got started. Then the next generation, the bold, are the people that were pertinent to the clocks, okay? So Ed Herschede was a very important player in the clocks and the jewelry store. He ran the Frank Herschede jewelry store for almost 50 years. And then his wife, Lillian Noble. Lillian is an interesting person. I've done some research on her as well and picked up some of her 1910 original poster from the Ohio Valley Fair. One of her books I've gotten. And so and I also just recently got a 1911 magazine that's big that she did the artwork for the page, the cover. So she came from a very famous family, Thomas Satterwhite, and he was a painter that's very well known in the Cincinnati area and in New York. There's been a number of galleries here in Cincinnati that have showed his paintings. So she comes from a very prominent artistic background. So she was a key player, and she also painted, hand-painted some of the early Herschede dials. I found through the research that she had a shop in the early 1900s, 1920 kind of time frame. She passed away in 1922 from the flu, unfortunately. And so that's why he's been married. And then unfortunately, he's met with a lot of tragedy. And when I watched and looked through history of what happened with Ed Herschede, his first wife died of the flu, Spanish flu, in April. His father died in September of 1922, all in the same year. And then his second wife died of the flu as well, very young. And then his third wife outlived him. So he went through a lot, and his daughter died at 25 years old. At the time that they had the largest heist in the company's history. And so he just met with a lot of tragedy in his life, and he was very well liked. All the reviews of him and everything that I found in writings, he was always highly thought of. And so when you start looking at these without understanding all this history, what you find when you start looking at some of the, if you can't hear me, remind me to come back to the mic. What you find when you start looking at all the history is that some of these names start popping up. And unless you know you've got a chart like this, you don't know that they're actually part of the family. So what happened is, like Leo, he was a banker in the banker's family, and there's another one that was actually the Clark. The Clark family, James Clark, shows up in a lot of the legal papers of Hershede's. And he was a lawyer, and his father was a lawyer, and they have a beautiful mausoleum in the cemetery. I found theirs. I spent a number of days when I was out here earlier visiting all the cemeteries and have pictures in the book about all of the plots and so forth where all the family members are. So this is generation 2. Lawrence was jewelry store. Walter John Herschede, many of you know, was the next generation to take on the clocks. He was a key leader in the Herschede Hall Clock Company. Alfred was the youngest of the children, as far as the 1887, and he mostly focused on the automobiles for Herschede. So that's kind of where he focused. In the early days, he was doing some clock work in the Hall Clock Company, but mostly in the automobile industry.
Clocks for automobiles?
I'm sorry?
Clocks for automobiles?
No, Herschede, one of the things in the very beginning of the book, in this chapter 1, I talk about is all the many businesses that Herschede was in. And they actually got into the automobile industry. And so they had that for a number of years and then ended up selling it out. But they were in many businesses. You'll see a little bit of that. The third generation, let's see if I can put my pointer here. So Mark, many of you have probably heard of Mark and Joni. She just fairly recently passed away. She was very prominent in Cincinnati as a donor in the University of Cincinnati as well. William Foy was the oldest of Walter's children. He was the only child that actually went to Switzerland for the horological training and spent 3 years there. And so he received his certificate. Mary, we're talking about one of the businesses in the 1950s. They came out with covering clocks, the dials. And she actually opened up a business called Marlou. And she was responsible for covering the clocks with fabrics of choice. And so many of the families would have their own kind of patterns that they had or their decor that they had. And so she was responsible for that, as well as Walter John Jr. In the 1954, he started the service center. And so he serviced the GE clocks, the Herschede clocks, and so he and Marlou worked closely together because they were the two that did the covering of these clocks, the custom works kind of things. And then Dick Herschede, he went by Dick, and he was the senior, and so he was very prominent. He started very early in 1934, and then he was the one that moved, he and Robert Herschede, the next one here, moved down to Starkville when they made that transition from Cincinnati to Starkville in May of 1960. And so eventually what happened, these two, when they moved down to Starkville and took over the Hall Clock Company leadership, and Robert had more of a sales background, and then Dick had more of the manufacturing side. And then when they got the external investors in 1967, another change happened, and Dick Herschede became the leader of the manufacturing, and then Robert Herschede returned to Cincinnati with his family. So that's the third generation, some of the key players that played a role. And I have Joni highlighted because she took in a Model 100 clock in 1992 and put it in put into the jewelry store, and that was the one that Howard Klein, many of you might know Howard Klein and have seen him through the years because he was active in NAWCC and also had a shop in St. Louis. And what was I gonna say? Then they
Joni Rock.
Joni, thank you. And the clock that Howard Klein had put together, the first Model 100, was to celebrate 100 years of Herschede making of clocks. And Howard Klein wanted the first clock to go to the Hershedes, and so that's the one that went into the family, or into the business. And there was a story written up on that, and it was kind of fun. So she played a role in continuing the legacy. She was also kind of interesting when I went through the R&M files. She had sent a letter to Randy Thatcher and congratulating him in 1992 on purchase of the company. And she sent some Crown newsletters. They published some Crown newsletters in that early 1990s. And so there was some in there. And one of the stories in the Crown newsletter was the Model 100 being delivered and put into their store. So she did play a role, and she tried to continue the Herschede connection with the family in Starkville, as well as staying tight in Cincinnati. So that's the third generation. All still, you see a lot of players here. that were still active in the business. Then the next generation, and the last generation of the family that really touched the Herschede clock industry was, oops, so I get for clicking the wrong button. He played a role as a superintendent down in Starkville. Unfortunately, he passed away at a very young age of cancer, so it was a real loss for the family. And he was Mary's son. And then Dick Herschede brought in, when he graduated from school, Rich, they called him Rich Jr., came into the business as a controller. So he spent a number of years as a Hershey Hall Clock controller, and then as the Arnold Industries controller. And then in the latter years in 1983, he became the president of Arnold Industries when John Robert Arnold took a CEO position and really focused on transitioning the company to closure. That's what he focused on. And I've spent a lot of time, I'm not going to cover it here today, but I have spent quite a bit of time on the later years, and spent 9 months going through the Arnold Industries board meeting minutes and extracted out all of the Herschede clock information and logged it all into tables, and then summarized it for the book. And then I graphed a lot of the financial data. So there's a lot of financial data that's been graphed for those later years as well. It gives us a lot of insight. And I was very lucky to get those financial information in the books and some papers. The selling of the company papers, the $11.4 million that they sold the company for, all that is in the book. What happened with those, I'll tell a quick story here, is that I had asked Doug Herring, I spent 2 weeks in Starkville, Mississippi in 2016 doing interviews. And so I interviewed and worked a lot with the executives, and then I spent also time with the employees. And I had asked Doug Herring, he was the board secretary, I said, I like stocks. And so I said, do you by chance have the stocks? And he goes, well, you know, I'm not sure if I do. And then the next morning when we were meeting for our interview, he comes and opens up the back of his car and it was full. And he said he was the CEO of the banks in Starkville. And he said, I went to my old secretary, because he long since retired, and she opened up the bank safe, and we went to the back of the safe, and there was all the papers. So after 32 years of sitting in a bank's safe, they were pulled out, and I got to go through all of them. And so that's why there's a lot more detail in those later years than anybody's ever seen, because I got to get to the real documents and really put the story together. So I was thrilled, you can imagine, to see all that stuff come together. I was just thrilled. All right. So I'm going to do a quick summary of the family leadership, and then the next slide is going to talk about the external leadership that happened. So 1877 is when they started. Frank, his brother, and then he had his sons join at different times as they grew and matured at ages. And so this is their years of when the company was formed and then coming into play. The next key time frame is in late 1902, and that's when the Hershede Hall Clock Company was formed. That was in December of 1902. I do quite a bit of research in this area, and Neil here was actually instrumental in that as well. We spent a lot of time, I went to St. Louis, and we went and spent, 3 days at the St. Louis library going through the 1904 World's Fair papers, trying to find things on Hershede. We did find a few things, that's in the book, some pictures we've got in there, and what we started talking about was what motivated Frank Herschede to start the company, the Hershede Hall Clock Company, in December of 1902. And through our discussions and all the things that we were learning as we were looking at all the paperwork, is that, and I put this in the book because I put the form in there, the first question on the 1904 get an exhibit at the World's Fair, are you incorporated? Are you a corporation? That was the very first question. Well, he knew that if they were going to step into that role, and he took a very big role at the World's Fair, that he needed to be a corporation. So he quickly, he knew when the forms had to be turned in, because they had to be turned in 1902. They come very early in the World's Fair as they go through that whole lengthy process. And so he had to get forms in, he had to get, incorporated. And so that was his motivation to get this company formed and to get it ready for the World's Fair. And then we step into the latter years in 1922 when Frank passed away in September. The Hall Clock Company had to go through another change. That's when Walter took on some roles. Actually, John was Secretary Treasurer, Walter President, and Lawrence had Vice President, Edward had Treasurer role. Again, the sons were going across many of these businesses and taking on different roles that they had. So they were very, I tell my family all the time, here's a family of leaders. These guys were very responsible, moved into a lot of leadership roles, and were very interesting to watch their careers and what kinds of things that they did. And then the 1960, we saw the transition to Starkville. Dick and Robert, I talked about earlier, took a role there. So now we're gonna go to, I forgot my arrows. I had some animation here. There we go. Maybe I'll remember it on the next one, huh? There we go. All right, external leadership. So things started to change in 1967. When they started having, they went through, the move was very costly. I talked to Stuart Vance. He was an executive and an industry. He invested in the Hershede Hall Clock Company along with John Arnold to get them started again. And he told me that they showed up in style. Their trucks were nicely packed, and just the way Hershede did things, right? High quality, high style. They always took pride in what they did, and so he said it was a very expensive move for them. And one of the things I dug into a little bit more was the change in the move. I captured in the book, I don't have it here, but the auctions that happened. They sold off a lot of their equipment. They sold off, of course, all their office supplies. They sold off some of the Rookwood stuff. So they were selling off a lot of things before they actually made the move. So 1967 was external leaders, and that came into play with John Robert. He was the president and treasurer of Howard Furniture and the Hershede Hall Clock Company. There's a lot of documents that show both his name on both of them as presidents. And then Stuart Vance was a key player in the sales in the early days, and Dick Herschede for vice president. And then there's a number of players here that played a role as far as directors. And in 1973, we saw the formation of Arnold Industries, and that was a conglomerate of furniture, lamps, the Hershede Hall Clock Company, Motor Guide, the fishing trolling motors that Hershede is famous for making, and that's what actually was the attraction for Brunswick when they bought the company. They shelved and archived all the Hershede clock stuff, put it in a back corner. They were nicely organized and boxed and numbered and everything. They archived it all, and it was all about fishing motors. So a very different model. And so these guys all had new roles as they formed this company. It was in April of 1973 that they formed, and they took on new roles across all the divisions. And so you can see those players here. Again, Dick Hershede was well known as a clock master and in manufacturing, and the stories that I got from some of the employees, that he was well liked, very well liked, and he would walk the factory. He was in the factory all the time. He worked with all the employees and was just highly respected, and the executives respected him very well, very much as well. So lots of good things there. Carl came on from the Howard Furniture, and then Shannon and those two were in partnership there, and then Rich had the controller role. And then in the next and closing transition was Arnold Industries, and so they all went through different roles there, and over time their roles changed, as I mentioned, with Rich in 1983 becoming actually the president of the company. 1983, many of you lived through this. They went through a big change where they said, we can no longer afford to make cases anymore. So what we're going to see and take to test with the industry is, can we just make movements and sell them for people to put into cases? And that started to happen when I went through the board meeting minutes. I saw this whole thing happening. When they first started in all of these discussions, they were approached a number of times about selling just the motor guide, the fishing trolling motors. And Hershede said no, or John Robert Arnold said no. And then, 6 months go by, 9 months go by, and they're still hurting. And then they started entertaining certain kinds of things. And so you could see the whole thing unfolding through the board meeting minutes. And so they finally got to the point, they said, well, if we can make this many movements and bring in this kind of money, we can survive by selling just movements. So they tried that. And so that happened from 1983 to 1984, and then they said, we're not getting enough business here. So they decided to close. And so that was a big decision for them, as you can imagine, and a hard decision for a lot of people. And the furniture side of the business wasn't sold until 1985, and that one sold into Flex Steel, and they made the seats and stuff for RVs and so forth, and they used the same plant. A lot of the employees went from Arnold Industries into that company, and so I got to visit some of them there and go into the facility and what they've done. So that's the external side. Very quickly, a lot more covered on that if you have interest in the book. So these are my charts. I'm just going to cover a few things, but it gives you a flavor. These are the pages that I have in the book on the executive leaders. I wanted to have something that was simple for people to take a look at. So I captured their personal leadership, and then their executive leadership. And this is all built from microfilm. So I've got 250 hours of microfilm reading time where I literally visually sat in the library for 250 hours going through and scanning all the pages in the Jeweler's Circular. And NAWCC was very important to me for that because they loaned me all the microfilm so I could do this because it was a huge effort. And I would go through, and every week I'd try to find and pick out anything that was going on with Herschede. And that's how I was able to build these executive profiles, because none of this exists anywhere. It's all in microfilm, and them tracking what was going on with Herschede through time. And so, and I got things like from his passport. He was 5'11", brown eyes. So I was very able to kind of build, and then I found out where, he was buried, and I did this for all of them, and tried to give insight to, who they were, and how did they travel a lot or not, and where did they travel? All that was being captured everywhere, or in the microfilm, I should say, not everywhere. It wasn't even in the newspapers. The only thing I could get out of the Cincinnati newspapers was ads, and I'll share just a few of those. When I did the book, one of the things that was really important to me, and I did this when I went through the microfilm, is I wanted to know who the competition was. And so when I went through the microfilm, I also pulled all of the competition that would have been, that Hershede was competing against. So I pulled ads for like Harrison Harrington. The Bow Wow and Daughter ads I loved. They are hilarious. When you get to watch, when you look at them in the book, you'll see what happened. They were very aggressive in their advertising and their language, everything that they did. And they started off with English movements. English movements were the best, right? And then they made a transition to German movements. And then, German are the best. And then the competition, Harrison Harrington, were competing with that and say, don't go after, a lookalike like German, you stay with English, And all these ads were showing up in the Jeweler's Circular. And so those I've captured off of microfilm and put them in the book. In every business year it was happening. So you can see the transition and the things that were happening in the world, in business. So, sidetracking here. And then on this personal leadership, there's a lot of donations. You're going to see through the personal leadership that the family members were very active in their communities. And I got the community piece of it out of the newspapers, because the newspapers in Cincinnati, the Enquirer, was reporting on, the community kinds of things that were happening in the world. And so he was quite a mentor. He mentored his brother, he mentored his sister Anna. They all had roles and so forth. And then the executive leadership, many of you know that he started in 1873 as a clock repair person at the Cook industry. and a company, and then 1877 he started his company, and he continued to grow. You could see what starts to happen. In 1910 he had an active role in the exposition that happens. Those were very prominent in the Jeweler Circular and in the newspapers. Cincinnati is very proud of that festival that happened every year. It was a big deal. The businesses, they all talked about, you know, they were all decorated, and it was just a very big deal for them. And he took on executive roles, and he went out to the president and met with the president to try to get funding for the government exhibits for 1910. So he took and he invited Taft to his home for dinner. So he was very prominent. And then in 1918, a very interesting story that I came across on that one is that he was accused of being a traitor because he's from Germany, and they didn't like that. And so he got very upset about it. And it was in, again, the Jeweler Circular microfilm. There's a whole story, I got it all captured in the book, because he was very upset about it. He went after the government agencies and had them do a
Retraction.
yeah, well, not of that, go do research on where that came from, and he refuted it, and he said that my businesses and my family is here to make sure that, you know, we succeed. My factories are here, we will help with this war. And so he became very active in the war contracts and so forth that happened, and his businesses were, you know, turned over to the war. And so there was a lot that was happening here, and he became very proud of that connection to the war. And then he did a lot of state-of-the-art catalogs. Of those of you who've seen some of his early catalogs, very nice catalogs, very high quality again. His last thing, in the last picture I actually have of him standing in the back, is they formed in 1922 a horological organization, and he was appointed to be one of the supervisors along with a number of other leaders in the industry. So that was one of his last kind of leadership things that happened with Frank. The other thing with Frank is that you'll see that the jewelry store did a lot of custom work. They did a lot of custom clocks, they did a lot of custom jewelry, and they did a lot of things for events. So lots of things there. This is John Herschede. I was never able to recover a picture of him. It's something I will still try to do because I'm very interested in what did he look like. He's the only one I couldn't find a picture of. And so again, he was very prominent, buried in the same cemetery as his brother. Started very young, traveled a lot, and he took on, you know, different roles at 13. He had an engraving position after the sales started, where he grew, I guess, experience-wise. And so he took on multiple roles as well. And the one thing I'm going to mention here that was very important, I came across two things that was very interesting, and I was just thrilled to find in the Jeweler Circular microfilm. He went out on a road trip in 1911 to announce the Herschede movements. And in these two articles that were put into the Jeweler Circular, one of them was that his trip on doing that, and that they came out of, the technology came out of Germany. So the movements, the Herschede movements started with German technology. And then the second thing that happened was they had brought over some of the German supervisors and the specialists and the masters. And the Herschede employees were not happy with the style of the German supervisors. They went on strike. It was great to read this because it just showed what the transition and how hard it was for the people. And the other thing that was interesting about it, and one thing I would have liked and done and never got to, was I would like to have looked at the immigration records, because there were no movement skills ads. You would have thought in the Cincinnati and stuff, as they were ramping in 1909, 1910, the Herschede movement production, that you would see employment ads for, you know, people to work on the movements. There were none. So they trained their employees, they brought over employees from Germany to get these movements started in 1911 when they launched them. So that's very interesting, and John Herschede played a key role in these transitions. In fact, in the Herschede serial number books, the first few clocks were actually sent out on behalf of John Herschede to certain locations, one of them being Kansas City, and that was some of the influence that he had in trying to get these things out to the market in the beginning. I need to keep moving here. Edward Herschede, this is his photograph. He's very prominent. He shows up in some newspapers, and he's, you can read all this. I talked about his difficulty in his life that he had, his tragedies. He also was very highly respected. He was like first in the gemology industry, and when it was first formed. So he played very key senior roles. He also signed his mother's death certificate, and he died just a few months later. So he was the oldest son. And then, as you can see, he started in sales and then continued to take on roles. He was also very key in the hall clocks, because he would cover for Walter Herschede when Walter would take his leave. Walter had health issues. He was regularly traveling to Florida, and that's where he would rest, and then Edward would take over and cover for him during those times. All right, and he was around, he is the second longest employee or leader of these companies. He was around in leadership roles for 53 years. The longest one is Walter Herschede, which I'll talk about. So this is Walter Herschede. I got this picture, which was kind of fun. It's not ever been seen before. I've been working with his great-granddaughter, Mary Ann Herschede, and she had some photographs, and those are in the book. This is a crop of him. They were at some kind of event. She doesn't know what it was, but they were all decked out. Tails and his, all of they had, you know, their top hats on and stuff, so I just thought this was kind of fun. He was also very well liked. The family thought a lot of him. And he was also viewed as an innovator, and he came up with a number of patents. So there's a lot that happened with him. He again transitioned the company to Starkville with his two sons. He also was an avid tennis player and coach for his children. So there's a lot of personal things that he did. A lot of inventions he did. Clear tone radio was one. So there's a number of things he did. He was the one that set up the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. I found a blurb on him traveling out there and his time there. So he was instrumental in driving that. And he helped with the transitions. Let me keep going here. Okay, so this is Dick Herschede. I believe he's the last one I'll cover. There's other ones in the book, but I don't cover them all. Dick Herschede, like I said, was very well liked. He is actually buried down in Starkville, Mississippi. He's one that stayed down there, and his remains there with his family. Rich Herschede is still down in Mississippi with his family, and his family is actually distributed, but he's still there, and his wife. And so he very active in sports. I found him in a lot of articles of what games he had played and so forth. So he was a very active sports player in high school. Very well liked. I've got some information on him captured. He started very young at 19. One thing I should mention about Walter, when they first moved the Hershey Hall Clock Company to Plum Street, which is their first factory, it was still a leased building. His father, Walter Herschede, that I just talked about earlier, was there working on some equipment, and he accidentally on the saw cut off 2 of his fingers. And the only reason I knew about it is because I found it in the war draft cards, and it listed him as being crippled, and it said which hand and which fingers and so forth, and that's how I knew that there was something had happened. And then I found it in the microfilm, and so it was captured there as well. So that was just kind of an interesting tidbit of what he had gone through as he became experienced working the equipment. He is again quite active, helped with the move, and then he went through history. He started to 1962 was the president, and then he moved into manufacturing with Arnold Industries. And so he was also instrumental from 1976 to 1981. Many of you would have experienced this, and this is when they went through retooling of the movement. And they started changing some of their parts, trying to get the parts cheaper, and easier to manufacture and so forth. So he, in the board meeting minutes, he was regularly, every week, talking about the progress, giving reports, how much money's being spent, getting approval for that money, because it wasn't easy to get the money. It was a lot of money to retool. And so he really made that happen. He kicked off engineering meetings. I have some of those bulletins. I don't think I put any of them in because of the length of the book. But I have that information on some of the engineering meetings that they regularly had as they made that transition to retooling. So he was around the business. He did a 50-year party celebration down in Starkville as well. So he was around for a long time. Okay, so funding, 1877. How did Frank Herschede get started? And so when I spent time at the Cincinnati Archives Museum that's downtown, I went through all of the records there as much as I could. Spent about 4 days there, and I found this. And this is from this is actually a picture from his archives. They have the books there. They're about this big and that wide. And they're all handwritten like this. They're a pleasure to read. And on this side was, what he was purchasing, and over here on this side was what he was selling and what they sold for. But this particular entry caught my eye because it was early on, a year after he had opened, and it says, bills pay new note favor of Mrs. Mary Herschede, dated July 1st, 1877 in full. And so he paid his mother back the $1,500 that he had loaned from her when he started his business in 1877. And then I found further in some of the other pages, some of the other people that had contributed to help him get started. So these are all the funds, and then he contributed $909 that were recorded in the Herschede records of what it took for him to get started. So the grand total, $6,000 back in that period of time, which equates to about $171,000 today, is how he got started. He purchased a lot of material and stuff from here. It's a joy to go through these books. You can see what's being purchased: the silver, the crystal, the watches. You can see some of the stuff that was being purchased by him, and it was a real joy to go through these records. I took a lot of pictures so I could put the story together, because I had to go back and do a lot of research on what it meant. So now the business opens, and the first thing is that he was at number 9 Emory Arcade. This is the only picture that's ever been found. The museum holds this, and it is his jewelry front in 1877. And this is an interesting location because it was like almost the first mall. And so they had 40-foot high glass ceilings and a whole bunch of these little stores. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. The first purchase that he made in his records was to Ian Welch in November of 1878. And then he sold it a couple months later for $88 in 1879, the early part of 1879. So that's the first record of really his clock purchase that he would have put into his business. And then he had another one in 1880 from Frank Kroger Clocks. And then his first large purchase from Ansonia was in 1882. And he made a number of large purchases to Ansonia. So he carried the Ansonia clocks, no doubt about it. There was a lot of purchases. But I love the storefront. You can see there's a clock here. There's watches and chains in here, and some watches in here. So it's just kind of a fun picture to see what he looked like when he started. So when he started, this is where he was in this arcade. Okay, here's the fountain for those of you who are familiar with Cincinnati. And so this is 4th Street and Vine. And so this is where he started in 1877. He was here to 1885 for about 8 years. Okay, a very small store. And when he was there, he was under the this glass ceiling here, And he was paying rent that was recorded in the books from $45 to $100 a month, okay? And then he moved from here, just down the same building area, to 179 Vine Street. And so this is where you can see that. Now what's interesting about this is, I started asking, what did this area look like, I wonder, you know? And so I started looking around, it's like, how could I find it? So what I did, these are the Sanborn fire maps, okay? They're all through the book, you'll see them, because I use these. They tell you what was around, what businesses were around, where they were, and how things were situated at that era of time. And so what I did, I said, okay, well, what's around here? Oh, Western Union. So I started searching in the Cincinnati archives, is there any pictures of Western Union? And this is what I found. So this is literally this corner right here, looking down the street, Vine Street. This is Western Union Telegraph. The arcade, there's a little bitty sign right here that says arcade on it, so that's this right here. And then when I started blowing this up and looking at it, I had so much fun. There's a horse drawn carriage there. So this is a very early 1902 picture that lets you know what this area looked like when he was in business there. So this was also, this location, the very first time that he was advertising that he actually had a basement that had clocks in it. There was no basement here, but he was definitely advertising at this time and at this location. So that was interesting to see that transition. So now the clock, everybody always wonders, where was the first clock cases made? What happened? There's a lot of speculation, but now I pieced it all together. And I backed into it actually as I started to find information, and then I started going back and looking for more things. This is an ad, you can see here, Factory 511 West 2nd Street. That was his first factory, okay? And this came out of 1901. So what happened in his records, from 1891 to 1901, he contracted cases from a company called Kroger, Sabert and Company. That later became, as he split off Sabert Furniture Manufacturing, and he made his first payment in May of 1891 to have contract cases made. I found an ad here. I started looking these guys up in I got maps and stuff of where they were, what they focused on, what they were known for in the industry, and they were known for doing fancy high-end cabinet work, okay? And when things started to happen, clock cases were added. So you could see the transition that they were going through in their investment in clocks. And then the first clock case factory was noted, and over a span of 5 years, 89 to 93, there was $19,791 that was evenly split between Durfee's clocks and movements and these contract cases. And those records are all captured in his financial books that I showed you a snippet of. And so I was able to piece this all together and what exactly he was spending money on. And then they expanded from 511 to 517 as he grew in that factory. All right, so the next thing that happened is, well, how much money did he make? What was he up to in these early years? And we haven't seen this before either. But he had bits and pieces of paper, and some of them was written on stationery that he had. It said Frank Herschede on it, his location, and then it had the crown and hammer symbol on it, and then there was handwritten financial data on the notes. And so I started piecing everything together and built this chart. Whoops. And if we could just keep going. What happened is he was ramping, right? This is when he started, he was ramping. And then in the 1889-90 timeframe, the clock started to kick in. Right? That's when he started, I told you the investments that were happening, he started investing, he started getting his return, and it really started to ramp up. And then what happened is we hit the American financial panic. That's what we're going through now. And so he hit that in his business, and that's what the dip came from. And then he climbed back up. The other thing that happened in 1902 was that he had a major water pipe breakage above him. And it came down and ruined his, what they called fixtures in that day, which is all his cabinets. And all his cabinets, by the way, were made by the Frank Herschede, or by the Hall Clock Company. And they're beautiful cabinets. I got a few pictures, but that caused him to dip because he had to take a loss. He had a loss of material and a loss of cabinets. And so that's really when the business growth took place in the very early years. Let me keep going here. So the other thing you start to think about, well, everybody knows, or most people know crowns, right? I gotta keep going quickly. So the crowns, I started watching what happened with the ads as we saw them. And so what happened is in November of 1902, the first crown movements were being noted and the symphony tubes were being noted in advertisements. That's the very first time they were showing up, okay? And then we know in December, they formed the company. So they were preparing for the trademark of the crown, they were preparing for their brand, and so forth. And then in May of 1903, the first crown hall clocks were being noted. This was starting to be used, okay? It didn't happen until this time period. And then the trademark, the first crown trademark is added to the ads, okay? And that started happening in September 16th of 1903. So this is a complete ad that basically shows they started calling them crown hall clocks.
Oops.
Time's up.
The projector's on, it's not getting a signal.
Keep talking, it'll be back.
Did the cord come unplugged from the side of the computer?
All you had to do was stand up.
Magic touch?
All right, so this was a very key because you could see the transitions that were happening as they started to form the company and getting the brand noticed and so forth. So it's a very important thing because you always kind of wonder how these things happened and how it happened. It was all over time. This was not overnight. It took time to get through this. All right. The next thing that happened that was major was 1911 when they first started shipping their movements. So I really like this one, and I chose this single slide because in 1911, this is the very first movement, and they put a plaque on it. And this first movement went to Frank Herschede. And so this is the very first movement. What's happening with my computer? Let me get logged in again.
The plug's good.
That's good. There it is. Okay. So this is a plaque that happened, and this is what's on the plaque. And so I just bolded some of the key things that are noted on the plaque that was engraved and went to Frank Herschede. This clock is actually still in the family and has been passed down through the generations. It's a model 122. And that was actually offered before 1911 with German movements in it. And then when it must have been one that he liked or something, and then this movement was put into that case. All right. There we go. Oops, too far back. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, that works. Okay, so the next thing I thought I would highlight is not everybody is familiar with the trademarks that Frank Herschede and the Herschede Hall Clock Company has developed over the years. So they first started in 1884 with their ads with this symbol, okay? And it's the very first time it showed up. That continued on into about 1910. You'll see this is from one of my clocks that I have that it's very early, and they also put it on the movements. So this is on the dial and they put it on the movements. So when you see this, you'll know that this is a very early clock, okay? Then they went into, when they were making the transition to their movements and the crown emblem, they started with engraving a crown. And what was interesting about this one is that there's actually many different kinds of crown engravings that were done. And so I've got like 4 examples in the book because they're all different. They've got some similarities, the crown has some similarities, and then this was different. And then there's another one, number clock 2, that is completely different. A very different kind of crown. All crowns, but a different style. So it's kind of interesting when you find some of these crowns, you're going to see a little bit of variances as you look at their clocks. And then, as we know, the emblem that we all know and love today, from 1911 to 1992, has been present. So I just kind of wanted to highlight, in the book I talk a little bit more about clock signage, getting into the weights for the papers, and a number of different things, dials and so forth. But I just wanted to hit these three things here today. All right, the other thing I wanted to do was to try to understand what their product portfolio looked like. So I've actually developed product roadmaps, and they're in the appendix of the book. And I started marking all of the clock models, when they started and when they stopped, and what the price was when they started and what the last price was that I could find in any literature. Some of it comes from ads, some of it comes from catalogs, some of it comes from different places. Those are two of the major places. And then I started logging everything, and I said, well, what was going on? So from 1890 when they started to this kind of era when they stopped doing the hall clocks, the big ones, they had 85 patterns, numbers 3 to 166 that were offered. And they offered them mostly in mahogany and oak, okay? And then they started coming out with the 100 series and the 200 series. So that started in this era in 1922. And then the junior pattern series 300 started. So that came during this era. And then the petite clocks, the series 400, started in this color here. And so you can see when you look at all of these added together, that in 1913 and 1921, that was really the height, which is when he was around, Frank was around. So, there was a number of product offerings at the height, and it gives you kind of insight to what was happening through the generations and what products are being offered. I'm gonna move on. So I've got 2 more slides, so I can wrap up for Q&A. This one really intrigued me, and I really enjoyed because there was a lot of records in the archives in Cincinnati on this grand opening, and there was a lot of information in the microfilm. This was a huge event for Frank Herschede. This was the last company or last location he got to enjoy. When you look at the book, this is the picture that I have, and I really enjoyed this one. And what you can see, here's the Model 120. So this is a view looking from the front all the way to the back in the mezzanine, okay? This is another view of it, look just at the very, very back. And so what happened is when they had their grand opening in November of 1921 on 4th Street, Sadie and Frank, they described this in the microfilm, stood on this mezzanine and met all of their guests. It was a huge event. All these flowers and so forth came from all the people, the huge crystals. There was clocks back here, just a huge event. This building was very costly. It was one of the most costly buildings at that time in Cincinnati. And all the records on how much this is in the book, I put a table together on what was spent and who did what work on the building. And so it was very interesting to see that happen, and there was a lot of hype on it. So this is the last slide, and this is about Frank and the closure with Frank. Like I said, the early years, 1922, he passed away. He was only here for a few months before that's all he was able to enjoy with the building. And so just a few highlights. This is a full view of the picture, and right here is a plaque. And on that plaque, it's a very ornate bronze plaque. It says, Frank Herschede founded this business in 1877. The store is dedicated to him and the esteem of his successors and the Frank Herschede Company, October 28, 1921. A very beautiful bronze plaque. And then over here is a bronze water fountain. Over here are Willard clocks. I did some research on that and put that in the book about the Willard clocks that he had. And over here, what's really fun is I was able to track down through the Herschede records. I know the serial number of this clock, and that's what's listed here. They were shipped to him on November 8th for the grand opening. I don't know where they're located, but whoever's got these clocks, make sure if you ever see a 120 or a 228, check the serial numbers, because I'd love to find out where they went to, because they were there at the grand opening, and they were sent there special. And there's a number of other clocks that are over here that I didn't track down through the records. So that basically, wraps up the talk. And many thanks to people. I get a number of phone calls regarding Herschede clocks. I've had a lot of fun conversations with people and their stories. I've uncovered now 2 Model 100s that have been developed. The original one that Howard Klein sold to an individual. He called me by fluke, and I just started talking to him. Another one just last week has another one. So I found 2 of the 5. I don't know where the other 3 are, but those are the last clocks that he made. And then last year there was 4 more clocks made from the Model 100, all beautiful walnut clocks that have the Herschede movements being put into them right now. Glass is being made and so forth. So there's 4 more that are coming out, and they're beautiful clocks. I really enjoyed it, and many thanks to everybody for all your stories. Thank you. So, I know we're supposed to transition to other things. I'm certainly open to any questions. I do have a few books here, 3 of them, that's all I have here. I've got a palette that will be coming out the 1st of July tour, and I'll have them online for purchase there. And then we brought a couple mugs for people that might be interested in. I made some Herschede mugs for fun when I put the crown on the back. So I've done some fun things. And so if you're interested in all of those, you can let me know. And then there's a notebook that we have here for if you want to sign up for anything or talk to me any further. Make sure things are recorded there. So should we open it up? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any questions or comments or curiosities that you have?
When did they transition out of the jewelry business?
1996, they closed their stores.
How long?
Yeah, they lasted longer than the business. And one of the other things I asked myself, what was the relationship between Starkville, Mississippi Herschedes and the Cincinnati Herschedes? Because there was some ill will that happened as they moved out. They did stay in touch. I found some notes, letters. They talked about what progress was happening with the factories being built in Starkville with Mark Herschede. So there was definitely communication that continued between the businesses.
What led to the move to Starkville, Mississippi?
What led to the move?
Yeah.
Well, you've seen things in newspapers and so forth. It was cost.
Okay.
They were trying to reduce overhead costs, labor costs, and as you know, you saw in the newspapers, right? Actually, it was one of the really nice things. Mary Ann Herschede, I picked up 2 of her family oil paintings, and she didn't have any children, and she said, "You know more about Herschede than anyone in the family." And so I purchased the 2 oil paintings of her family. They're done by a magnificent Cincinnati artist. She'd done a number of the governors and stuff here. She was very well known. Becker is her last name, and she married into the government officials' families. And so there's a lot of I want to say family things that happened there, and so the paintings, the stories that Mary Ann had of the families and the transition that happened. It was a hard transition for the family to move from Starkville from Cincinnati to Starkville. It was a hard one. But they did say that Walter came down quite often, spent a number of months down in Starkville. Betty Duncan, she was so kind and spent time with me in Starkville. In fact, you'll see in the book, she has they gave Herschede crowns as years of service souvenirs. And so they put jewels in them, depending on how long we're there. They had diamonds for, I think it was 25, and then she had one with emeralds in it. And so I got pictures of the crown that they had given her. So they did continue the community sense with Herschede because they were very employee oriented. But it was all about cost and starting a new factory, training new people, and really getting it going again. It was hard. It was not easy. Hold on. You had a question back here, right?
Yeah, one. So approximately how many clocks did Herschede produce in their existence?
That's a good question. There are some records, and I did capture that as well, for the 1950s. I got captured exactly how many clocks and which models they were that they made. There's very little records on how many they actually made. I was told by John Robert Arnold that on the D clock, model 250, there's probably a little over 3,000 of those made over the years. I did, Stuart donated, he got the very first model 250. And he donated it just a few years ago to the governor's office in Jackson, Mississippi. And so I wanted pictures of it, so we took a trip down there, and the governor was kind enough to meet with us, and we took pictures in front of the governor and Stewart in front of the #1 Herschede Model 250. So again, just a few thousand of those, and those went through changes as well. And then I'm trying to remember, I don't remember all the numbers for the 1950s that they, I got tables in the book on that. I can tell you this, from the 1911 Herschede records, there were a lot of mantle clocks made. Pages and pages of serial numbers of mantle clocks are in there. And one of the new things that I did in the back of the book is I updated the serial number logs on what was being shipped. And then I found a small notebook about this big of serial number information for the later years, about 1928 to 1968. And it notes in there like, okay, they shipped from this serial number to this serial number, this grandfather clocks, and this one they shipped grandmother clocks. So I got a better feel for what was being shipped, and then mantle clocks were being shipped. And so I tried to, give those updates. The other thing that I did is I went in on all of the mantle clocks and pulled out the times, the dates that they were shipping, and exactly what models were shipping in those eras. So those are all color-coded in the appendix as well, so that people could get a feel for which models were shipping. Because some of these models, some of them were in the catalogs and some of them aren't. So there are some things that were recorded there that I think are informative. But I don't have an exact number. There is not an exact number. Only in the 1950s can I give that to you, and you can come look in the book. Let me get here because you.
Do they make the cases and movements in Starkville, Mississippi? Or
Yes, they did.
both.
Yep.
They made both.
Yeah, they made both.
Okay.
Yep. They took a lot of pride in the cases. I stayed and spent a lot of time with Gary McMinn. He's in the book in the latter part on the Model 100, because a few of the clock masters went with Howard Klein and actually called Dowcraft, and they started a company to make the cases and to finish up the movements to put into the cases. And so some of the factory workers, went on to Dowcraft, and they took their expertise and brought that into it. And so yes, they were doing everything, and they were very proud of it, even today.
Was the chain drive grandmother clock movements, some of those German, or were those all?
Well, that's an interesting one too. Out of the
In
board
Starkville.
meeting. So they're both, to answer the question simply. The 1950s, 60s, they were all German chain driven. And then in early 1970s, early 1970s, they started development of their own chain driven grandmother movement. And that's called the movement 1200. And that was their very last movement that they made. And in the board meeting minutes, I was able to track and watch what was happening as they went through that development, how many they were making as they started the ramp, and so all that's in there. I did a graph of beginning to end on that one. And I also just recently, through connection with Jeff Champion here, this recording, he connected me with an individual out on the East Coast, and he happened to still have the Model 1200 movement brand new in a box. So he was very kind. We did a trade, and he shipped that to me not that long ago, just before I was getting ready to wrap up the book. And I took a number of pictures of that movement and put it in the book because that was their last one. And so that was a fun one to see and to have it recorded.
There was a line of electric chiming tall clocks. I
Yep.
own one, and I can't think of what the name is they marketed those under.
Real bigger.
Were those actually built by Herschede?
Yeah, that's another interesting story. I opened up one of the engineering notebooks that Mary had in the archives, and it was all full of 1949 and 1950 information. And when I opened it up, I thought, wow, look at this. There's a number of letters in there of Herschede making cases and how much they were selling them to Revere, and they're all listed in the cost what was being done. Herschede made the cases for Revere. And so I put a couple of those letters in the book as well because it's very interesting in telling what was going on. There was mostly a lot of mantle clocks because there wasn't nearly as many grandfather clocks of the electric ones being made.
I have 5 too.
Do you?
Yeah,
Okay.
wonderful clocks, wonderful.
Yeah, they were everybody's high quality, right? That's all high quality. I have the records for the electric movements as well. From when they started, the first one recorded was November of 1927, and those records are all typed for the electric, and that includes the Herschede electric, the GE clocks, and some of the other electric clocks are in there. And so all the serial numbers are recorded for those clocks as well.
During the early 1930s, around 1932 or 33, Herschede started an inexpensive line of electric clocks called crown clocks. I've got a few examples of those.
Okay.
And they didn't last very long. I just wondered if you found any information about the crown electric clocks.
No.
Volume,
Believe it.
volume two.
Yeah, volume 2, thank you. Wow.
Have you ever seen the book 150 Years of Electric Horology?
Uh-huh.
Well, there's a section about Herschede in there. It was written by Howard Klein.
Okay.
And there's a single sentence that mentions the crown clocks. And I talked to Howard about it once.
Okay.
And he told me that he found that information in a written history of Herschede
Yeah.
that he had access to when he owned the company.
Right.
Anyway, later I talked to Randy about that. And he gave me the book and he loaned it to me for a while. Anyway, I found information about crown clocks, and there were actually 2 sentences in that book.
Yeah. So,
Anyway, there's not much.
yeah, there's not, I haven't seen that come up in anything that I've uncovered. I never saw it in any of the, I will say 1930 to 1933, in that period of time, there's very little information. And I have only uncovered an L.E. Kaiser company brochure and what was being offered at that time. And so that's the only thing I've actually, uncovered, because that was during the war, the depression, not the war, but the depression. And so people stopped doing things, stopped brochures, they slowed down on everything. So the literature and finding information in that era is very hard. So what you're referring to, there was a paper that, and I have this in the book as well, that Richard Sr. Commissioned Herb Peck to do. He wrote a 36-page or 63 or 68-page paper, a white paper basically is what we would call them, on the Herschede Hall Clock Company. And so there's some things in there that I was not able to substantiate, and so I left them there. But I will tell you, when I was in Starkville at the library down there, the librarian told me, because I spent time reading some microfilm on the Starkville stuff, I really loved doing that there as well, because one of the first things that was an aha was there was an employment ad in 1960, and it was issued under Pinocular, not Herschede. And they were advertising for clockmakers. And they did it under Pinocular because they were making a transition and they hadn't told everybody about everything that was happening, and so they were keeping it as smooth of a transition as they could. So there's some things that are being recovered or uncovered, and in that Herschede paper that you have, there's tidbits of things that are in there. Very, very little information, like a page on the 1960s and later. Very little was in there. There's hints in there. So the paper is very useful. And when Dick Hershey, I was going to say earlier, brought that to the library, he said he gave it to the librarian, and he told the librarian that someday somebody's going to be interested in writing a book about Herschede. And there I was.
Wow.
And that's what happened. So that was very exciting, that he knew someday somebody would do something, and he wanted to see it. And there's tidbits of things in there. The other thing that you'll see, and also in the NAWCC bulletin, there was a hint that there was a Kansas City Power and Light custom clock made. And I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, in the suburbs in Grandview. I didn't move out to Seattle. I went there for school at the University of Washington, and then moved down to Portland area. And Kansas City Power and Light was my father worked as well. And so I thought, this is interesting. So I started calling the building, the Kansas City Power and Light building, that is still there and present. And I had really hoped to find the clock there. And they said they were in the process of changing the Kansas City Power and Light building to luxury apartments. My heart's like, I said, there's no way I'm gonna find a clock, you know, in a building that's going through that kind of renovation. And I had just been to libraries with Neil and so forth, and I said, you know, I'm gonna call the Kansas City Public Library. And I called a few times. It took me, you know, a couple of days or so to try to get through to somebody. And I got hold of someone, and the guy says, you know, I think I've seen that clock. It's downstairs in the lobby. And I was so excited. And so I headed up to Kansas City and spent the day down there, and sure enough, I walked in, it was a Revere clock. A 5-2 clock that was made, literally custom made in the shape of the Kansas City Power and Light building. And they hand carved it all. And I had another expert that had a clock master down in Kansas City that wasn't too far from there. I asked him if he would go and look at it as well. So he and another furniture maker went and looked at it to evaluate it for me. And they said, yes, this thing has been all custom done. It states that in the Herschede paper. That's where the hint came from. I would have never known to go look. And so there are hints around. When you see them, you have to start digging and seeing if there's any way to uncover anything else that happened. And that one was there, and it's a great looking clock. I've got pictures of it in the book. It was fun to find. So there's some more of these clocks around. There's another clock, for those of you that live in Pennsylvania, I wonder if it's still around. There was only 2 clocks that were ever made the cover on the Jeweler Circular, okay? One was Harrison Harrington. The second one was a Herschede clock. That Herschede clock that was made and on the cover was a railroad clock. And it's all custom done. Custom plaque was inscribed for it. Special steam engine on one side and another kind of railroad engine on the other side. So those of you who are in a railroad, you'd love this clock. If we could ever find it, I'd love to find this clock and get it photographed. It had, as if a guest showed up, and it was a special gift to one of the executives of one of the railroads. And so it's either in a family somewhere. I haven't had a chance to, you know, some of the railroad museums and stuff that might be on the East Coast to start tracking that thing down. But that was one special clock, huge clock and beautiful. So some of these custom clocks are out there. And sometimes I've got a couple examples of articles where they would show up in the newspapers. Somebody years later would talk about getting it restored and how it came about. And so some of these clocks, Frank Herschede, also in the Jeweler Circular in the microfilm, there was a number of times where they would list custom clock done. And in 1904 for the World's Fair, another special clock, if we could ever find it, those of you that are out there, there was an Egyptian clock made for the World's Fair, and it came very late into the World's Fair. It was shipped, again, I'm finding a sentence here, and then the next week another sentence, and the next week another one, so I could piece it together. It was a clock that was made for $2,000 in 1904. And it was Egyptian made. There's Egyptians, and you'll see it in the picture, again, in the book. And I also blew it up so I could study what clocks were in the display at the World's Fair. And that clock was there, and it won the gold medal. And so there's a beautiful clock. It's kind of got an Art Nouveau style to it, kind of curved on the front. I can't tell what the dial is even when I blow it up. It's a different kind of looking. I can't tell if it's got a moon arch. It's got an arch, but I can't tell if it's a moon dial on it or what they've done. But that was another very special clock that was done, shipped late. Like I said, the fair had already opened. They already had their exhibit. It came in late. So there's a number of these things out there. There's a lot of jewelry, custom loving cups that were done for events, watch fobs. Another one that came up, if you guys track the baseball special fobs for the World Series, Frank Hershede's jewelry company did those, and it describes them. My suspicion is there was never Frank Herschede on the back of them because there was a book written on one. It described it to a T, no mention of Frank Herschede. But in the microfilm, describes it to a T, Frank Herschede made them. You know, so you start comparing notes. Those are out there in the industry somewhere. And if you if you're into baseball and stuff, and he did them for a number of years, he won the contracts. And he did them for a number of years, and so those are out there as well. And those would be, I never found one. That would be fun to photograph and to put in. But I tried to capture everything that was custom that I could find.
I have one comment though before. I had a chance to meet Christine through a contact a number of years ago before the book was I think even thought about, and we've become friends with Jeff over the period of time. But I've been to, my son lives about 20 minutes away from Christine in Portland, and I've been to their house a number of times. Beautiful, a lot of clocks, but I just, and the trips that she's taken, the amount of work that has gone into this book, I just can't describe. It's just been a work of love and a great effort, and I'm so proud that I've got a copy of the book that she's written. It's a great job, Christine. Thank you, and congratulations.
His clock is in there. He's got number 20. Passed down through the generations. And so his book is in, or his clock is in the book. I tried to capture 2 early clocks. Number 2 and number 20 are in there. Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
You guys would give me just 5 seconds? Yeah. Christine, thank you very much for coming and sharing everything you have with us about this. We were really lucky to be the first ones to hear your story publicly, so small token of certificate, but very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay.